Would you recognize dignity if it wore sweatpants and carried a worn-out backpack? The morning light crept gently across the mosaic-tiled floor of Portland International Airport, bouncing off metal benches and sleepy travelers dragging roller bags behind them. Among them walked a woman in a dark gray sweatshirt and light sweatpants, her blonde hair hidden beneath a faded black baseball cap. She looked like she belonged to no one, and nowhere in particular. Her name was Grace Landon. At 34, Grace was the kind of woman most people overlooked, until they didn't. Her steps were purposeful, her face calm, but if you looked closer, you'd notice the tiny silver bracelet on her wrist, worn and polished by time. It had once belonged to her grandmother, a woman who had worked 2 jobs and still managed to smile through everything. Grace's phone buzzed. A message from her husband lit up the screen. "Call me when you land. I miss you already. AL." AL, short for Adam Langston. The name meant little to most people at the airport, but for those in the know, he was one of the most powerful tech innovators in America. He had transformed eco-transportation, founded 2 unicorn startups, and 9 months ago, bought out an entire airline, Cascade Air. But Grace didn't fly private. Not unless it was a security issue. She preferred flying like everyone else. It reminded her of the people who mattered most, her students, her parents, her past self. She ordered a black coffee at a quiet cafe near Gate C12, slipping a crumpled $5 bill and a couple of quarters into the tip jar. The barista, maybe 19, maybe 20, smiled. "Boston, huh? Visiting or work?" "Family," Grace replied. "40th anniversary. My parents." "Nice. Enjoy the flight," he said, handing over the coffee. He never once looked at her clothes. Grace made her way to the gate where a digital sign blinked. Cascade Air Flight 3201, first class boarding now. A few travelers had already begun to line up. Sharply dressed businessmen with briefcases, women in heels and trench coats, a middle-aged man in a designer windbreaker clutching an expensive duffel. Grace joined the line, adjusting her backpack. A businessman in front of her turned halfway, looked her up and down, then turned back. He whispered something to the woman next to him, and they both chuckled. It had begun. "Boarding pass, please," the gate agent said. Her name tag read, Maya, Team Lead. Her smile faded the second her eyes reached Grace's sweatshirt. Grace handed over her phone. Maya scanned the QR code. A flicker of surprise crossed her face. She looked down, then up, then down again. "Miss Landon, first class?" she asked, as if the words themselves were out of place. "Yes," Grace said plainly. The gate agent nodded too quickly, forcing a brittle smile. "Enjoy your flight." But her eyes said otherwise. Grace walked down the jet bridge. Her sneakers barely made a sound. Inside the aircraft, the first-class cabin glowed with understated luxury. Leather seats the color of warm sand, matte gold reading lights, a faint citrus scent in the air. A flight attendant with a chiseled jaw and a navy blue uniform named Cole stood waiting. Grace smiled. "Seat 2A. Cole's eyes darted to her backpack, then her cap, then her outfit. His smile tightened. "To your left," he said, as if reading a script he didn't believe in. Grace sat, placed her backpack beneath the seat, and pulled out an old paperback. The cover was faded, the spine cracked. She had read it dozens of times. That's when she saw it. A second flight attendant, a woman in her early 40s with shellacked hair and a stiff posture, leaned over and whispered to Cole. Their eyes flicked toward Grace. Cole approached. "Excuse me, miss, may I see your boarding pass again?" Grace raised an eyebrow. "You've already checked it." "Just to verify, for our records." Grace calmly handed over her phone. Again. He studied the screen too long. His brows pinched together. Then he walked away. 2 rows across, a woman in designer sunglasses leaned over to the man next to her. "Did she say first class?" "Maybe she wandered in," he replied with a laugh. Grace turned a page in her book, pretending not to hear. But the whispers spread like spilled coffee. Carla, a senior attendant whose badge read cabin supervisor, approached next. "Ma'am," she said in a tone that suggested anything but respect. "There seems to be a discrepancy. Are you sure you're in the right seat?" Grace set her book aside. "Yes, 2A. I booked it myself." Carla's lips stretched into something that tried to resemble a smile. "We just want to ensure you're comfortable and in the proper cabin." Grace's voice remained steady. "Unless you have reason to believe I'm not Grace Landon, there's no problem." That got Carla to pause. And then came the moment that truly changed everything. Richard, the lead steward, marched up holding a tablet. "We show this seat assigned to a G. Landon," he said slowly, as if spelling it out. Grace looked at him. "That's me, Grace Landon." He looked unconvinced. "Do you have ID? Are you asking every passenger in first class for ID?" she asked. "Ma'am," he said curtly, "we just need to make sure you're where you're supposed to be." A businessman behind her cleared his throat. "She's been asked 3 times. If she says it's her seat, it's her seat. She's probably someone's assistant," a woman 2 rows ahead whispered. "Bought a ticket with points or something." Grace exhaled slowly. She could end it right here, say the name. Adam Langston, her husband, the man who owned the very airline she was flying. But she didn't, because this wasn't about who she was married to. This was about the fact that she was being judged for how she looked. Again. And it wasn't going to stop here. If you saw someone in sweatpants in first class, would you assume they didn't belong? Or would you ask why that matters? The cabin of Flight 3201 had fallen into that quiet hum before takeoff, the kind that whispered of privilege, of money, of practiced stillness. Except near seat 2A, where all stillness had vanished. Grace Landon sat perfectly straight, her palms resting on the pages of her open book. But her eyes, they no longer followed the words. They followed the way judgment drifted around her like invisible smoke. Carla, the senior attendant, crossed her arms. "I'm afraid we'll need to reassign your seat, Miss Landon. There's been a booking error." "That's not true," Grace replied evenly. "You've verified my ticket 3 times now." "You've refused to show ID," Carla said. "We're trying to protect the integrity of the cabin." The phrase integrity of the cabin made Grace blink. Cole added quickly. "We're not saying you don't belong, just that this sort of thing occasionally happens when upgrades are issued in error." "I wasn't upgraded," Grace said firmly. "I paid for this ticket." It wasn't loud, but it was enough. Every eye in first class now turned to her. Some were trying not to stare. Others didn't care. Across the aisle, the man in the windbreaker leaned toward his wife. "They let anyone in here now," he muttered. Grace heard it. Everyone did. Carla forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "We'd be happy to offer you a seat in business class for the remainder of the flight." "I didn't buy business class," Grace said. "I bought this seat, 2A." Carla's lips pressed into a thin line. She looked toward the front of the cabin where Richard stood, his arms folded across his chest like a sentry. He nodded once, and that's when Carla made her mistake. She leaned closer and whispered, though not quietly enough, "Ma'am, we have a brand to maintain." Grace blinked. "Excuse me. Our first-class passengers expect a certain standard. If you could please gather your things." The words clanged like steel doors in Grace's ears. From behind, a new voice broke in. She said she bought that seat. Everyone turned. It was an older man in seat 3C. Gray hair, tweed blazer, a book of poetry resting on his tray table. "I saw her boarding pass," he said, looking at Carla. "She's in the right seat. You, on the other hand, are in the wrong story." Carla flushed. "Sir, I assure you, we're simply following—" "Bias?" the man interrupted gently. The cabin went still again. Richard took a step forward. "This has become disruptive. Miss Landon, if you do not comply, we'll have no choice but to escort you from this section." Grace slowly stood. It wasn't anger that filled her. It was resolve. She picked up her backpack, slid her book inside, and said in a calm, crystal-clear voice that every passenger heard, "This is discrimination, not misunderstanding, not protocol, just plain, old-fashioned judgment based on what I'm wearing. And every one of you saw it." Carla stepped to the side. "Please follow me." As Grace moved toward the curtain that separated first class from the rest of the world, she felt the sting, not just of humiliation, but of something worse. Silence. The kind of silence that meant no one else was willing to speak up, until she passed the tweed gentleman. "Don't let this make you small," he said softly, eyes warm. "Some people shrink when they're mistreated. Others expand." Grace nodded. "I plan to do the latter." She walked through the curtain, back into economy class, where elbows touched and knees cramped, where the snacks were fewer and the smiles were thinner. She found herself in a middle seat between a teenager scrolling on her phone and a man snoring against the window. Diane, the third flight attendant, placed a paper cup of water on her tray without looking her in the eye. "Enjoy the flight," she muttered. Grace stared at the water, then out the window. She thought about Adam, her husband, how he had begged her to take their jet, how he always insisted on protecting her from these moments. But Grace never wanted to be protected from the truth. Because if this could happen to her, with all her privilege, all her power, then what was happening to women who didn't have any of that? To people whose stories couldn't make headlines? The plane taxied toward the runway, the engines roaring to life. But the noise in Grace's mind was louder. She wasn't just going to tell Adam what happened. She was going to show him. And if you knew anything about the Langstons, Grace and Adam, you knew this wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning. The next morning, the sleek glass exterior of Langston Air's corporate headquarters reflected the early Denver sunlight. Inside, the tension could have been bottled and sold. In the 28th floor executive boardroom, Chief Experience Officer Miranda Hale adjusted the collar of her cream blouse for the third time. Her assistant, nervously flipping through a printed agenda, whispered, "The chairman's arriving in person. He's on his way up." Miranda stiffened. Chairman Langston? He never attends quarterly reviews. Apparently, he had a personal reason. Miranda's heart skipped. A personal reason from Adam Langston usually meant someone had failed, badly. In the back row of the conference room, seated together and sipping complimentary lattes, were 3 uniformed flight attendants, Carla, Richard, and Diane. "This must be about the service awards," Diane murmured. "Has to be," Richard said with a smug smile. "We've had top marks on every transcontinental route. They probably want us to model the new luxury training program." Carla crossed her legs confidently. "About time." Then the door opened, and silence swept the room like a wave. Adam Langston entered, tall and composed, wearing a charcoal gray suit, no tie. His presence, calm yet razor-sharp, had the power to freeze breath midair. But it wasn't just him. Walking half a step behind, dressed in the exact same outfit from yesterday, gray sweatshirt, light sweatpants, simple sneakers, was Grace. She didn't smile. She didn't wave. She just walked in quietly, with the certainty of someone who no longer had anything to prove. And everything to say. The 3 flight attendants went pale in unison. Carla's mouth parted slightly. Richard blinked rapidly. Diane looked down, her hands clenching the paper cup of lukewarm coffee. Adam spoke first. "I believe some of you have met my wife." Not a sound in the room. No cough, no chair creak. Just the tick of a digital wall clock counting the seconds to judgment. Miranda Hale stood. "Mr. Langston, we're honored. Mrs. Langston, Grace, we didn't expect—" "No," Grace interrupted softly. "You didn't." She turned slowly toward the 3 attendants at the back, and neither did they. Adam sat at the head of the table. Grace remained standing beside him. Miranda cleared her throat, hoping to salvage control. "Let's begin with our usual metrics." "No," Adam cut in gently. "Let's begin with what happened yesterday." A pin could have dropped. No, a pin wanted to drop but was too afraid. Grace stepped forward. "Yesterday, I was judged based not on my boarding pass but on my outfit. I was questioned, challenged, and ultimately escorted out of a seat I paid for." She let her gaze land directly on Carla. "All because I didn't look the part." Carla opened her mouth, but Adam raised a hand. "Not yet." He turned toward Miranda. "Do you know how many passengers this happens to every month?" Miranda hesitated. "We track service complaints, but not—" 27, Adam said. "We pulled the incident logs. 27 passengers, many women, many people of color, many dressed simply, flagged, relocated, or misunderstood by your premium service staff in the last 3 months." He flipped open a small leather notebook. In only 5 cases was identity verification requested for a passenger in business attire. In 22 cases, passengers in casual clothes were interrogated. 2 were removed. 1 was my wife. The room throbbed with discomfort. A junior executive leaned toward her laptop, as if praying it would swallow her whole. Carla found her voice. "Sir, Mr. Langston, it wasn't about appearance. It was just policy confusion." Adam's tone sharpened. "Was there confusion when Mr. Templeton, seat 3B, boarded last month in a tracksuit and wasn't asked for ID?" Richard flinched. Diane opened her mouth, but Grace spoke before she could. "You didn't see a problem with me. You saw a problem with how I looked. I didn't disrupt the cabin. I didn't raise my voice. I simply didn't meet your standards, for wealth, for polish, for belonging." Miranda tried to pivot. "We can use this as a training moment. I'll ensure we implement new procedures. We're not here for procedures, Adam said. We're here for transformation. He stood, walked slowly toward the 3 flight attendants. Oicho, firing you would be easy, he said, but that would fix nothing. You'd leave thinking this was about one woman's wealth and a PR crisis. Grace stepped beside him. That's not what this is. Diane's voice cracked. Then what is it? Adam's voice softened. This is a reckoning. He looked at Miranda. Starting today, every customer-facing staff member will go through our new Dignity First training initiative. Every internal incident log will be reviewed for patterns of bias. And as for you 3, he faced the stunned flight attendants. You'll spend the next 60 days in economy class. They blinked, serving passengers whose seats barely recline, whose meals come in plastic trays, who still deserve every ounce of respect you're trained to give. And after that, Grace added gently, you'll rotate into customer advocacy. You'll hear the voices of those who've been overlooked. Carla swallowed. And after that? If you learn from it, Adam said, you may rejoin first class, but not before. No fury, no screaming, just truth. Just power used the way Grace always hoped it would be, not to crush, but to correct. The meeting ended not with applause, but reflection. As Grace walked out, still wearing that unassuming sweatshirt, every executive in the room stood, not for show, but because suddenly they saw her differently. And for the first time, maybe they'd see everyone differently. 3 weeks had passed since that boardroom reckoning, and the ripple effects were undeniable. At Langston Air's main terminal in San Francisco, a quiet but noticeable shift had begun. It was in the way the ground staff now greeted passengers with genuine warmth, how gate agents looked beyond designer coats and polished shoes, and how security officers offered equal courtesy to businessmen in Armani and teenagers in hoodies. But perhaps the biggest change had taken place not at the counters, but in the hearts of 3 flight attendants. Inside a modest training suite near baggage claim, Carla, Richard, and Diane sat side by side, not in first class, but on the other side of the customer experience. They were listening. They were watching. And most of all, they were learning. This is Patricia, said Monica, the new head of Langston Air's Dignity First training program. She gestured toward an elderly woman at the front of the class. Last year, Patricia was denied access to the first-class lounge. She had the right credentials, but the agent assumed she was confused. Patricia stood tall, her voice steady. I'd saved for that trip for years. It was supposed to be a milestone. But when I walked up in my gardening jeans and fleece, the man at the counter told me I must be lost. She turned her gaze toward Carla. I wasn't, but respect sure was. Carla dropped her eyes. Later, they met Simon, a black tech engineer in his 20s who'd been interrogated at check-in for having a suspicious one-way first-class ticket. Then Lisa, a young woman in a wheelchair, who shared how a flight crew member once addressed her companion but never spoke to her directly the entire flight. I was the ticket holder, Lisa said softly, but they treated me like the luggage. By the end of the first week, Richard wasn't talking as much. By the second, Diane had stopped smoothing her uniform every time someone walked by. They weren't performing anymore. They were awakening. One afternoon, the 3 were assigned to assist in the call center, handling real-time customer complaints. Carla took a call from a woman who'd been told to dress more appropriately before entering the business lounge, even though her leggings and sweatshirt met the stated policy. I was mortified, the woman said, voice trembling. Everyone stared, and when I asked for a manager, they said it was just a misunderstanding. Carla closed her eyes. I'm so sorry that happened to you, she said. And this time, it wasn't scripted. Meanwhile, Richard was taking his turn on the economy cabin rotation. Gone were the sleek suits and sparkling water requests. Instead, he was offering pretzel packets to a mother cradling a crying baby, helping an elderly man reach the air vent, kneeling to retrieve a fallen earring from the aisle floor. At first, he felt like a tourist in a foreign country. But slowly, uncomfortably, he began to belong. One day, a young man in an oversized hoodie boarded and hesitated at the row numbers. Need help finding your seat? Richard asked, more out of habit than effort. The young man looked at him warily. Yeah, I'm in 19A. You're right here, Richard said, motioning. Middle seat, sorry, but I'll bring you a ginger ale on the house. Long flight ahead. The kid blinked. Thanks. And just like that, Richard realized how little it cost to see someone fully. How little and how much. At the end of the economy service cycle, Diane surprised even herself. While helping a blind passenger navigate a tight aisle, she didn't just offer her arm. She crouched, looked him in the eyes, and asked, "Would you like to walk at your pace or mine?" The man smiled. "Yours sounds just fine." Later, during her break, Diane stared out at the tarmac and whispered something she'd never said before. "I think I forgot what this job was really about." And now, slowly, she remembered. At home, Grace followed their progress through weekly updates from HR, but she never asked Adam for details. She didn't want gossip. She wanted change. And it was happening. The dress code was revised to eliminate image-based language. Lounge access policies were rewritten to focus on credentials, not appearance. And perhaps most meaningfully, the employee feedback channels now allowed anonymous reporting of biases, whether subtle or overt. What had begun as humiliation was now becoming transformation. One evening, Grace stood at the edge of the Langston Foundation's new scholarship gala, a night dedicated to supporting women in aviation, hospitality, and human services. She wasn't wearing heels. She wasn't in a gown. She was in a sleek, simple black jumpsuit, her hair pulled back, no makeup but for a bit of balm. Just Grace. As she mingled with guests, she noticed a familiar figure near the back of the room. Carla. Not in uniform, but present. She held a wine glass nervously, standing beside a donation booth, her posture uncertain. Grace approached gently. "Didn't think I'd see you here." Carla turned. "I wasn't sure I should come. You're here now." Carla hesitated. "Mrs. Langston, You don't have to apologize again," Grace interrupted. "I'm not here to apologize," Carla said quietly. "I'm here to ask how I can help. I'd like to sponsor someone. A young girl who wants to work in aviation. Someone who might never be seen if she walks into a room wearing the wrong shoes." Grace didn't smile. She just nodded. Because some apologies don't come with words. They come with change. 3 months later, Langston Air Flight 882 was preparing for takeoff from San Francisco to Washington, D.C. In seat 2A of the first-class cabin, a woman in a cream sweater and black joggers looked out the window as the jet bridge slowly pulled away. A black canvas tote bag sat beneath her feet, scuffed from use but clean. Her hair was tied back into a neat braid, no makeup, no jewelry, except for a delicate silver bracelet with a date engraved on the inside, April 12th. Across the aisle, a man in a business suit glanced at her, then returned to his email. This time, no double take, no smirk, no whispers. Grace Langston sipped a glass of still water and opened her paperback novel just as she always had. Moments later, a flight attendant approached her. His badge read, R. Becker. "Mrs. Langston," he said softly. "Just checking. Would you prefer lemon with your water?" Grace looked up. Her eyes met Richard's. She smiled. "You remembered." Richard's tone was earnest. "It's my job to notice the details now." He stood tall, his posture polished not from pride, but presence. The uniform was the same, but the man wearing it wasn't. "And if you need anything," he added gently, "don't hesitate. You're always welcome here." "Thank you, Richard," Grace said. "That means more than you think." He gave a respectful nod and stepped away to attend to another passenger, a teenager flying solo, nervous, tapping her foot to a quiet beat in her headphones. Richard crouched to eye level and gently said, "You'll be just fine. If you need anything, I'm 2 rows away." Grace watched him for a moment, then turned back to her window. Yes, change had taken root. Back at Langston HQ, the ripple effect was being felt throughout the system. In a press conference that aired nationally, Langston Air announced the results of its new Human First initiative, a comprehensive overhaul in how it trains, monitors, and uplifts both passengers and staff. The press didn't expect what came next. Standing on the small stage beside Adam Langston was not a marketing executive, not a PR director, but a woman in jeans, a gray blazer, and an unmistakable air of quiet composure. "My name is Grace Langston," she said into the mic, "and I was that woman in the sweatshirt." Gasps from the audience. The reporters leaned forward. "And I'm here today not to recount my experience, though you've likely heard it, but to share what came after. Because this isn't a story about humiliation. It's a story about repair." She continued. "For far too long, we've measured excellence by polish instead of substance, by how people appear instead of how they show up for each other. But true dignity isn't designer, and respect isn't reserved for the rich. The room fell silent, not out of discomfort, but reverence. I didn't set out to change an airline, she added. I just wanted to sit in the seat I paid for. Soft chuckles rose, then applause. When Grace stepped off the stage, a journalist caught up with her. Mrs. Langston, he asked, breathless, what made you speak up instead of staying silent? Grace paused. I remembered what it felt like to be 12 years old, walking into a ballet studio in thrift store shoes and being told I might be better suited for art class. She smiled faintly. That memory never left me, so I made sure it didn't happen again, not if I could help it. Weeks later, the final layer of change settled into place. Langston Air opened the doors to its new Equity and Experience division, where customer advocacy and inclusion were core, not afterthoughts. And the department's inaugural leader? Carla Mendez. She walked into her new office, modest, sunlit, lined with passenger letters, and took a deep breath. The same woman who once dismissed Grace now spent her days training others how to see people more fully. On her first day, she sent Grace an email. Subject, thank you. Message, you gave me a second chance I didn't deserve. I plan to spend every day earning it. Meanwhile, back in Washington, D.C., Grace exited the plane and passed through the terminal alone. But she wasn't unnoticed. A janitor sweeping near the gate looked up, gave her a small nod, and said, Ma'am, that video? Your speech? I saw it. Changed the way they treat us at check-in. Grace blinked. Really? He nodded. First time I ever felt seen when I wasn't wearing a suit. She smiled. Not a grand gesture, not a spotlight moment, but a quiet victory, the kind that mattered most. Can one quiet woman really change the way an entire world treats people? Or does it take all of us, seeing through the surface? 6 months after the incident on Flight 717, Grace Langston stood in a small art gallery in downtown Boston. The walls were lined with portraits, not of celebrities or CEOs, but of ordinary people captured in extraordinary light. A single mother holding a sleeping toddler on a late-night bus. A factory worker wiping sweat from his brow in the midday sun. A young girl in a thrifted dress, staring into the mirror with shy hope in her eyes. And in the center of it all was the final piece. A painting of Grace, not in a gown, not in heels, but in the outfit she wore the day she was escorted out of first class. Dark gray sweatshirt, light joggers, black cap, one silver bracelet on her wrist. Her face half-turned, not quite defiant, but undeniably unshaken. The title of the piece? Seat 2A, painted by Carla Mendez. Standing beside her former adversary turned ally, Grace couldn't help but smile. You got the bracelet detail right, she said softly. Carla's voice caught. I never forgot it. You touched it when you were trying not to cry. Grace nodded. I wasn't trying not to cry. I was trying not to shout. The two women laughed, soft, real, free. In the corner, a man stood watching them. Adam Langston. Proud, quietly emotional, and, for once, fully in the background. He didn't need to be center stage. Not today. Across the country, ripple effects continued. At Langston Air check-in counters, new posters lined the walls. True class begins with respect. At security lines, elderly passengers now received assistance without being condescended to. Young travelers in hoodies no longer got second glances. Passengers in wheelchairs were met with dignity, not delay. And at schools across the nation, Grace's story, now featured in civic textbooks, became a case study for ethical leadership. Ms. Langston, a high schooler once asked her during a virtual Q&A, were you scared that no one would believe you? Grace answered simply, I wasn't scared of not being believed. I was scared of being right and no one caring. And yet, people did care. And that, more than anything, changed the outcome. It wasn't Grace alone who changed the airline. It was the woman who filmed the incident and posted it, refusing to let it disappear into silence. It was the older man in first class who spoke up that day when others looked down. It was Carla who chose to transform shame into understanding. It was Richard who rewrote what service looked like. And it was Adam who didn't shield his wife with power, but amplified her truth with humility. Together, they had not just rewritten a policy, they had rewritten the story of what it means to belong. Back in Denver, on a quiet Sunday morning, Grace walked through the neighborhood park with a takeaway coffee in hand. A little girl with a pink backpack stumbled in front of her. Grace reached down instinctively to help. Thanks, the girl said, brushing her knees. I like your shoes. Grace smiled. They were plain gray sneakers, scuffed, lived in, real. They're my favorite, she said. The girl nodded. Mine too. She ran off to rejoin her mom, who stood watching from a bench nearby. As Grace walked by, the woman stopped her. Excuse me, you're Grace, aren't you? Grace Langston. Grace turned, a little surprised. Yes, I am. The woman's voice trembled. Thank you for what you did. It helped my daughter. At school, she has vitiligo. They used to tease her, but now they talk about how she looks like a hero. Grace's eyes welled unexpectedly. I didn't do anything heroic, she whispered. The woman shook her head. No, you just refused to shrink. That was enough. That evening, Grace and Adam sat on their patio, the sunset warming the hills around their home. He poured her tea, the ritual unchanged from their earliest days together. You ever wish it hadn't happened? He asked. She didn't answer right away. Then softly, sometimes, for the quiet it cost us, but never for the change it made. He nodded. She leaned her head on his shoulder, and the world, for just a moment, felt still. Have you ever been looked at like you didn't belong because of your shoes, your clothes, your scars, or your silence? Have you ever looked at someone and made a decision about who they were before you even heard their name? We all have. But what if we chose something else? What if we decided that dignity isn't earned by appearances, but owed by humanity? What if we stopped asking, do you belong here? And started saying, I see you. Come sit. Because respect, true, unshakable, everyday respect, is the only kind of class that should ever matter. And sometimes, all it takes to remind the world of that truth is a simple woman in a gray sweatshirt, refusing to sit anywhere but where she belongs.